Hey everyone, Stephen Gunlock here. I'm the pastor of congregational and group life here at City Church San Francisco. And it's my pleasure to get to welcome you to our first Meet Someone Interesting event that we'll be doing this summer. These will be a series of talks with members of the City Church community around topics or particular knowledge or wisdom that they have to share with us. Hopefully, they will be a time where you can meet someone who you might not know or learn something about them that you might not have known before. And perhaps something will come up around that when we're able to meet again in person. Tonight, I'm really excited because we have Scott Balsitis with us here, who is a virologist at Gilead Sciences based in Foster City. He has 15 years of experience working on antiviral drugs and vaccine development, as well as training from the CDC on viral pandemics. So I literally cannot imagine a more interesting person to talk to right now, our very own virologist to get to ask questions to. And so the plan for the next hour is we'll start with me and Scott talking. I'll be asking Scott a few questions. Scott will be sharing a few major takeaways that he wants us to come away with this evening. And then no later than 7:30, if not before, we will get to Q&A. So please start posting your questions for Scott now in the chat thread. We have, you can't see him, but we have Jason Morrell on here as our very incredibly awesome producer, and he will be getting the questions to Scott when we get to that portion. Caveat, we likely won't be able to get to every single question, but please ask your question because it will still guide the conversation. If we don't get to your question, hopefully we'll ask a different question that will encapsulate some version of what you asked. And last but not least, the sun is setting, and I have a blind reflection on me, but we're just going to go with that. But all of that being said, welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm excited to have been officially dubbed interesting by City Church. That feels pretty exciting. But also, I'm glad to be here, and I'm sorry I can't see everybody else who's there, but I'm glad to have some way to kind of connect with all my friends who I miss so much. I love City Church, and anything that I can do to connect to everybody, and just kind of, anything that my experience can do to help people with weaving through kind of the thicket that we're all in. I'm really happy for the chance to do that.
Yeah, well, we're grateful for you to be here and for making time for this. It's a really unique opportunity for us, and I hope you, get a break when sometime next year when the pandemic But to start off, though, I'd love just to hear a little bit about how you got into the field of virology.
Yeah, absolutely. So going way back, science was kind of always my thing in school, and going, in college, I went in thinking I would become a medical doctor just because I really liked the science and I wanted to do something helpful. But kind of realized partway along the way that there's a lot of ways to be helpful with science beyond just being a medical doctor. And I had gotten a chance to work in a laboratory and start to experience what that was like. And I took my first immunology class the same year that I otherwise would have been applying to medical school. And that just got me kind of hooked. I realized, hey, there's something else here that I'm really passionate about, and I should really kind of chase that down. And then I had applied to go to grad school, and originally was going to go straight from college to grad school and probably actually study bacteriology, not virology, most likely. But I was very fortunate to get this fellowship at the Centers for Disease Control. That was for people right out of your bachelor's degree to get some training in public health. And so I took that job, went and lived for a year down in Atlanta. Super fun. It was my first year away from home, but also my first year really getting, kind of a real job, and it was at the CDC of all places. And I got to work in the influenza branch. And influenza is another virus that causes periodic pandemics. I think everybody's kind of up to speed now on the flu pandemic of 1918. That used to be obscure knowledge, but I think now everybody knows about it. And I was part of a group there whose job was really to try to foresee pandemics just like this one. We were working on the possibility of a flu pandemic and working on potentially pandemic viruses. But that was very much in the vein, from early in my career, thinking about these kinds of things. Where do these viruses come from, and what might this look like when this does come to pass? So for my whole career, this has been something that I've been aware of, kind of would happen. The virology community has always talked about it that way, that this would happen. It was just a question of when. From there, I did move on. Went to University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got my PhD studying virology, and then also met my wife Miracle, who many of you know. Miracle and Elsa and Silas, say hi to everyone. Hi, everybody. And then from there came to Cal Berkeley for a few years for my postdoctoral fellowship, and then after that, like you said, spent the last 15 years really in drug development for viral diseases.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear about. And one thing I noted that you said was in the virology community, the expectation that this would happen at some point. I think for a lot of us, and me at least, like I had seen, I had heard that this would happen at some point, and I had seen movies about, worse versions of this happening. Even when this first became news in Asia in January, it never occurred to me that this would actually happen. And I'm not sure how that worked, but I remember pretty clearly at the end of February being on the crowded Judah, and or the end of February, having on this crowded train, my oh crap moment. Like, this is going to be a really big thing here. And I'm wondering if you had a moment like that, or what that moment was like for someone who actually understands, what was going on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think my oh crap moment came really just a few weeks before everybody else's oh crap moment, just because the virus moves so fast. Like, there wasn't, even for people who study these things, the tipping point where it went, okay, there's a new virus, what will happen to this thing's out of control, happened pretty quickly. For me, the oh crap moment. So we had taken a little kind of, trip down to Arizona to do some kind of school. We're a homeschooling family, and we were doing some kind of like school vacation, trip, studying a whole bunch of things in the Flagstaff area. And we had been, just kind of having a good time. And then just maybe 2 days before we were supposed to leave there, I went and was just checking the news. And I had been following, of course, the COVID-19 when it was in China. I always follow these things, the Ebola outbreak a few years ago, other viruses that, have been more obscure, but you may have heard of now, things like MERS and whatnot. These are things that I'm always aware of when they're going on, but most of them kind of flame out. So this is always kind of going on, not always, but, every couple of years, there's kind of something like this that kind of pops up and goes away. And so I'd been aware of this, back into January, and, kind of thought to myself, well, it'll probably flame out like the rest. Kind of saw it start to get bigger in China and said, okay, China got pretty aggressive about controlling it. And I was like, okay, that's good. But then I opened the news that day, and it was when they reported, really were starting to report the outbreak in Italy. And my oh crap moment was when they reported that they didn't know how the virus got to Italy. They realized they had a pretty substantial outbreak, and they didn't know where it came from. And for me, that was the moment where I realized that we were going to end up where we are today, because the public health authorities were already being very aggressive about the things they would try to do to contain this virus. And if they lost track of it that quickly, that was enough for me to realize that, the tools that we had were not up to the task. And we would continue to see the virus be ahead of us for, kind of a long time to come. Now, interestingly enough, we had plans to be in February. Another one of our kind of trips that we had planned for education this spring was to go on a cruise leaving from Italy in April. So that moment was a little twofold for me, where I was like, okay, this looks like it might be a pandemic, and that's really bad, but also like, wow, that was the worst possible plan I could have possibly made. And having not really known that, but I looked at Miracle and said, I don't think we're going on our cruise, love, and then we kind of had our first real serious conversations about it, and kind of, understanding, what this was all going to mean.
Yeah. It's nice to, in a way, it's almost kind of reassuring to hear that even you were a little caught off guard by the fact that this didn't flame out or go away. Like, I think even to the extent I heard about it, I was like, oh, these things never really get here.
Yeah, well, and in the past, they never, or at least in our lifetime, we haven't really experienced this. They always have.
Yeah. Well, needless to say, I'm glad you chose not to go on the cruise, but I hope you get to rebook that someday in the not too close future. Yeah. If you haven't already started posting, I can't see it right now, questions in the chat thread. This is just a reminder to go ahead and start posting those because we'll get to those pretty soon here. But another thing before we go to questions, Scott, that I just wanted to talk to you about a little bit because it's what's really been on my mind, and I think it's what's on a lot of our minds, is as we kind of go into this period of new normal for however long we're in this between now and when the virus is gone or there's a vaccine. I feel like there's a lot of questions around how to navigate risk as we build things back in, and questions about how much of our lives from before can we restart. Like, I know even for me, I just on Wednesday took an Uber for the first time since the middle of March. And it was kind of like, oh, I'm in a car with somebody and they're only really 4 feet away. I yesterday was really excited that I got to book a haircut for 6 weeks from tomorrow, July 17th. But I was on that. Like, I'm going to really need to get in there. But again, that's going to be another thing of being close to someone not in my household for 20, 30 minutes. And I just am anticipating there's going to be so many things like that over the coming weeks and months. And so I was wondering, like, what kind of advice you have for navigating risk. How are you navigating risk for yourself and your own family as we kind of come out of the at least really strict sheltering in place?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you bring up that question up front, because I think that's probably the thing that I'm hearing people struggle with the most right now. And I also really, like the way you pose the question in terms of navigating risk, because I think that's really key. Oftentimes, I get questions from people that say, "Is this, that, or the other activity safe? Is it safe for me to go visit my grandparents? Is it safe for me to go out to a restaurant once they reopen?" That sort of thing. And one of the things that I always, kind of encourage people, in getting just our mindset for getting out of the house and kind of getting back into, kind of this next phase, is to really avoid that kind of binary thinking, safe, not safe, and think more in terms of risk and kind of like what is an acceptable risk versus what's like kind of just a dumb risk or an unnecessary risk. And that still is hard. And I want to give voice to that for everybody. Like, if you're finding navigating like 1,000 little questions around everything you do to be really exhausting, like, me too, right? You're not alone. Knowing everything in the world that there is to know, about, viruses, even if, not that I know everything, but, even if you did, it still wouldn't make all of those questions really, really hard. So the thing that I've found to be most helpful in the way our family is approaching it is to try to figure out what level of risk is appropriate for your family, and try to, kind of set that. And then from there, you can kind of build out a set of decisions that don't feel overwhelming. Like, for example, for my family, nobody in my family is at particularly high risk for severe disease from coronavirus. We're all still kind of like youngish to children in my family. We don't have any, major underlying medical conditions that would put us at a particularly high risk. And so we think about it, we go, you know what, we want to think about this in two things. One, if we get coronavirus, it's not the end of the world, right? So it's not ridiculous. It's not silly to go outside the house. It's not going to be silly to see friends again. That's not irrational, right? But on the flip side, we also don't want to be dumb, and we want to do our part for the public health. Not be a vector spreading it to other people. And so make sure that we're asked. So the kinds of things that we'll be thinking about is, okay, what are low risk, kind of high benefit decisions to make? Right. So, when things start to open up, that we can see, a few families. Maybe we're not going to have big parties, right? We're not going to do that. Maybe we're not going to see everybody that we used to see as quickly as we used to, but to start to welcome a few kind of like, you've heard people talk about this concept of kind of like, creating like your sort of co-bubble or your shared bubble of people that, maybe you're exposing each other, but that's not all interlinked. And so there's not a lot of risk there, but there's, that's sort of low risk, but huge benefit because you get to hug someone that's not like in your house. Things like that. And just kind of those kind of like, what's low risk, versus, going to, a place where there's 500 people in the room, not that there will be very many of those, but that's going to be kind of high risk. And like, is that really necessary right now? Those are the kinds of things that we'll be avoiding. But that also, I want to, also specify that's going to be
All right, welcome back, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. That's sort of par for the course these days, but thank you for sticking with us. And we will allow a little extra time to kind of make up for the 10 minutes or so we just lost there. But Scott, I don't know if you want to go back to, you were saying you were about to transition from navigating risk as a high risk person or living with high risk people.
Yeah, that's one thing that I want to make sure, I say clearly is that, the level of risk that makes sense for one person isn't necessarily the same as for another person, because the coronavirus is a very different kind of threat depending on your age and health status, right? So that's something that, our family is thinking, we're not going to be going for zero risk, because zero risk means you basically can't leave your house ever. We're going to be thinking low risk, but some people might want to think very low risk. Some people might actually want to push for as close to zero risk as they can get, because it might make a lot of sense if you're in a very high risk category to go, hey, I'm going to push that risk as far down as I can go. So there is going to be, and I think we should expect, and I think we should embrace, different people having different risk levels, and just feel okay communicating about that with other folks. Hey, how are you feeling? This is kind of our risk level. Does this feel okay to you? And I guess just kind of normalize those conversations, that's an okay thing to ask about. We shouldn't feel awkward about it. And we shouldn't feel awkward when different people have different answers, right? If I say, oh, hey, if my family starts letting people into our, little kind of, bubble, and other people are not doing that, that doesn't mean that, we're being irresponsible. It doesn't mean that they're being paranoid. It means that this is really complicated, and then each individual or each family is going to need to make decisions that are really based on their individual circumstances, and that's okay. I think one of the hardest things about this pandemic is that there really are no obvious good and bad choices, right? Okay, well, there's some bad choices. Let me say that. Some things you just don't want to do. But all the choices have hard trade-offs, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so the trade-offs that make sense for one person may be a little bit different from what makes sense for another person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's interesting, the social dynamics that we're just beginning to learn to navigate around that, and having to have questions that can be deeply personal about doing some really basic things. It's challenging for sure. I don't know if do you think we're ready to move into Q&A now?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, okay. I think people have found it really helpful just getting a chance to get their questions out there. So I'd be happy to devote as much of this time as we can to just taking questions.
Great. Well, it looks like Jason's still kind of fielding through those, but it looks like we have the first one already up from Nikki. Can you see that on your end, Scott? It says,
yes,
what are you? Okay. Just in case in case people can't see it because it came up earlier. Nikki's question. Oh, it's on the screen. Okay. Yeah. What are your thoughts about children going back to school in the fall without a vaccine? Any prediction on when a vaccine will be available? Will it probably be phased out to elderly and children first, then everyone else?
Yeah. Okay. So great questions. So first thing is, we're definitely going to need to be making those school decisions without a vaccine. There's no way a vaccine comes before August, September. So that's something that we're going to have to face. I think that question, again, kind of falls into that category of there being, there's not really a right answer to that. It's kind of, you're going to see people, you're going to see parents, you're going to see school districts trying to figure out what's the least bad option. Because, while I do want to say that for children, the risk of coronavirus infection becoming severe remains extremely low. You've probably seen on the news reports of like a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children that has been reported. There's maybe 100 or 200 cases that have been identified. But compared to the number of people, the millions of people, who have been infected, that's a really low number. So I want to say that, again, it's not zero risk, but I don't want parents to be paranoid. Oh, my kids are going back to school and there's this horrible virus out there. Kids are the safest, from this virus in terms of severe disease. Exception there is very young children. If anybody's got like an infant, I want to be clear about that. If you want to take extra precautions, but for school-age children, they're going to get something that probably looks a lot like the flu in 99.9% of cases, or even less, and kind of move on. So the question is not really so much about the kids going back to school as who the kids will bring the virus to. Because I think we should, I've also seen the news, people say a lot of times, well, we don't know how well children spread the virus. Okay, technically, yes, but it's safe to assume that children can spread the virus, efficiently enough. So the bigger question is, okay, what does that mean? Who will the kids bring the virus to? And again, now it's different for every family, right? A kid that's living with an older parent or with a grandparent, very different scenario from a kid that's living with a younger, healthier parents. So I would expect to see the schools make a decision, and you may see different families opting in or out of that decision, because that's going to make sense for them. And I think you're seeing a lot of people kind of prepping to either stay remote. You're seeing schools maybe making preparations that maybe they have both remote and in-person options. All this is really challenging. But that's kind of one of the big, I think that's why, when you ask a question about like, what are the thoughts, there's many thoughts, and it's not a simple thing to decide yes or no. About when a vaccine will be available, the earliest a vaccine will be available will be towards the end of this year. There are some very promising candidates looking forward. Generally, we don't know everything for sure yet, but looking at what we know about coronaviruses, and I won't go into the details, it doesn't look like a particularly hard virus to make a vaccine against. So I think, all of us, who are in the vaccine world are feeling pretty good, that we'll get a vaccine against this virus. Which one it is that works the best, and how fast that one comes are a little bit more of open questions. And the two big wild cards kind of in that is how long does it take to test it? So there's definitely a push to do it as fast as we can, but there have been precedents when, you try to make a vaccine and either it doesn't work or in some cases even has negative effects, actually makes, people more susceptible to infection. So they can't skip that step. Those phase 3 trials you hear about, they have to be done well. We could do a lot of harm. And there's a lot of uncertainty how long that will take, because it depends on where the virus is, where's the outbreak, how many people are getting infected. And then the second piece is manufacturing, making 300 million doses of something that you've never made before. And that's just for the US market, and assuming that one dose gets the job done and you don't need 2 or more. That's a big undertaking. Now, fortunately, everyone's being very proactive about this. People are manufacturing at these massive scales before they even know if the thing works, which is pretty unprecedented. So if something does work, we'll be as far along as we can be. But definitely it'll be the end of year at the earliest. If there's bumps along the road, then it'll be pushed into next year. Last question was, will it be phased out to elderly and the children first? I'm going to say that I don't know for sure, but I would expect that to be data driven. One of the challenges with vaccines is that, and especially for COVID, is that in general, vaccines tend to work less well in the people that are actually at highest risk for coronavirus. So the elderly flu vaccines don't work as well. Other vaccines don't work as well. People that are immunocompromised, vaccines don't work as well. So you could kind of envision 2 scenarios. One is the vaccine actually works well in those populations. If that happens, you're going to want to vaccinate them first, right? Because you're protecting people that are at most risk. If it doesn't work well in those populations, you might see them actually pushing to vaccinate everybody else, where you're going for herd immunity to protect the vulnerable people, so the virus can't get to them, rather than use up all your precious vaccine doses on people who won't respond.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't heard that before. Is there a question 2? Can everyone see that, Jason, or should we read it? Okay. So this is from Jason Muscat. Hi, Scott. Musicians have lost their way of life during the pandemic and are eager to get back to performing for the public. What is the most responsible way to go about this? Too soon?
First of all, hi, Jason. I think it's a great question. I don't think it's ever too soon to ask these questions because, again, the trade-offs here are so profound. You're saying people have lost their way of life. That's so real. And that's really, really hard to balance against, right? The things we're doing to contain this virus, people are losing their basic income, their basic ability to, pay the bills in many cases. And we have to grapple with that in the best way that we can, because this virus isn't just going to go away, right? It's going to be with us until either we all get a vaccine or, we get to herd immunity, whichever comes first. And so we have to have a way forward through this. So your question about what's the most responsible way to go about this, I would say, expect that the bigger the gathering, the longer it takes before that sort of thing, A, is even allowed, or B, people are comfortable doing it. So now I'm not a musician, so I don't know how this works, but I know, I think thinking about ways to engage in smaller groups. Jason, I know you teach, private music lessons in smaller groups, or those sorts of things where you can still engage what you do, still engage people, maybe create a revenue stream, but that's something that functions in a group of 10 people, functions one-on-one, functions in a group of 20 people. Those sorts of things are going to be accessible and reasonable, I think, quite a bit sooner than packed, kind of concert halls that were, in many cases, where musicians were used to making a lot of their revenue.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so many people, musicians, other people that rely on public performance or services are really have had such a hard stop with this that I can imagine the question is very pressing and very painful in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
The next question, question 3 from Tom. In your opinion, what are the implications of the decision by the U.S. to withdraw from the WHO?
That's a great question. I don't know what the implications are. I will say that it's a terrible, terrible idea. There's no good reason to do that right now. In the middle of a pandemic is the worst conceivable time to do that. I guess I'll just stop there.
Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot more thoughts there that.
I'm trying not to get into the politics, but I think it's unhelpful when we're focusing on something other than just what gets the job done.
Yeah. Next question from Crystal. This is a good one. It's sort of bringing out in a particular way some of the things we've talked about, but Crystal's a nurse and she's asking, my patients have a chronic disease and are worried about taking a walk outside. How safe is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say outside is itself not the thing that creates risk. It's other people, right? Outdoors, just, from all the studies, the virus doesn't live well, doesn't transmit well outdoors. Indoors is where it's most likely to transmit because the virus kind of, gets blown away by the wind. It gets inactivated by the UV rays in the sun, all these kinds of things. Outside, you're keeping a better distance from other people. So, when you say go outside, it kind of depends. If you're going outside, if you can go outside into an uncrowded place, that's going to be a lot better. If your patients are able to, the N95 respirators are available again. Now that the hospitals have kind of gotten up to capacity, I've heard that you can order them on Amazon again, that sort of thing. The critical difference between the masks, the masks that we're mandated to wear are just a cloth mask or whatever. That's a mask that I wear to protect you, right? It catches the virus before it gets out. Where you can breathe it, but it doesn't do a great job of preventing you from breathing it in because there's all these cracks around the side that kind of the virus can just sneak in. Those N95 masks, they shouldn't be used for anybody who has respiratory difficulty because they're kind of hard to breathe through. But if somebody has normal respiratory function and they want to get outside but have otherwise chronic disease, I think I would very much encourage people to use those. because those actually do protect you from breathing it in. You might want to encourage people to look up like a YouTube video, how to properly wear an N95 mask. It's amazing how often I go to the grocery store. Well, I don't go to the grocery store that often, but when I do, how many N95 masks I see that are just completely not worn correctly. So you have to know how to put them on. It's not that hard, but a lot of people don't think about it. So if you can kind of keep distance from people, and if you want an extra layer of protection, use an N95 mask, or even just a pair of gloves if you're if you're not living a apartment building and you got to deal with elevator buttons and things like that. There's simple things that you can do, simple choices you can make that drive the risk way down. So I would say if you do those things, you're probably in a pretty low risk category.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I think it's helpful. There's been a lot of confusion, I think, around no masks than masks, but not using the N95 because those are needed in healthcare settings. So I'm glad that you mentioned that those are available again and that they do give people more protection. Next question from Fred Harrell. Do we have any concrete evidence yet about the virus and heat/summer temps? This was the thing that was going to make it totally go away, I thought. Just kidding.
Yeah, that was never a real thing. Although it was like that in the media, so I understand. So I don't, again, in the virology community, none of us expected the summer to make it go away. A lot of respiratory viruses spread more efficiently in the winter because the drier air and whatnot. But in this scenario where, the virus is so infectious and pretty much everybody it encounters is not immune. It's always been, I think, for us, clear that this virus would continue to spread. The summer at best would maybe slow it down. But if you think about, I guess, a couple of basic facts, do we have any concrete evidence yet? Concrete evidence we have is that this virus is causing outbreaks all over the globe. And in different spots on the globe, it's in different parts of the, seasons, right? And we're still getting outbreaks in all kinds of different places. We're getting outbreaks where it's hot. We're getting outbreaks where it's cold. So the virus clearly can spread. The other thing is that it does look like most of the transmission is happening in indoor spaces. And so if you think about that, well, what's going on outside is not going to be as important. That's where most of the transmission is going on. So it might help us a little bit, but don't assume that if we just release all the controls right now that the summer will save us.
Yeah, I'm glad that came up. There is even in my own perception, there's sort of this perception of it's summer and suddenly things feel a little better, but really I think it's just that I'm being allowed to do more, essentially. So. Well,
and we locked down so many things. The virus's spread slowed down dramatically, right? But that's probably more because of the lockdowns and the shelter in places that happen than the weather.
Next question from Esther, another good summer related question. Do you think swimming in community pools is low or high risk right now?
Yeah. So again, the risk is, I'm going to give almost the same answer I gave to the going outside question, which is that the risk is the people, right? And the number of people that you might be encountering or coming in close proximity to. So the pool itself is not a risk. The virus is not transmitted through the pool water. Pool water is, treated to kill viruses. That's not a real concern. But if you go to a pool and there's nobody else there, you're fine. If you go to a pool and there's a few people there and you keep your distance, also very low risk. If you go to a pool and you're like, wow, it's getting crowded, that's really what drives your risk, is the number and the proximity of the people.
Yeah, that's helpful. Next question from Kwong. While my workplace is still assessing whether to ask people to come into the office, I know the building management is putting in place some of the social distancing policies, like limiting to 2 people in the elevators, at most 3 people in the restrooms. Do you think these policies go far enough to lower the risk?
Yeah, so I'll say definitely those policies are good ideas because they do lower the risk. right? You're keeping distance. My workplace is minimizing the number of people who are actually in the building at a given time. Um, so those things are definitely good things to do. The hard part of your question, to be honest, is that word enough. Do they go far enough? And again, there's not one answer, right? So I think workplaces should be doing those things. I think it's very reasonable for a workplace to open back up again with those kind of policies in place. Those don't guarantee that there will be zero virus transmission, right? It doesn't eliminate the risk, but it does make the risk pretty low. So I think that's a reasonable thing to do. At the same time, if you are somebody who's personally at high risk, you might not feel comfortable with that. And that's something where, I'm not sure how different employers are handling that. I know at Gilead, we're not asking anybody to come back until they're comfortable coming back with their own personal risk level. So that's maybe, a good time to have a conversation with your employer if you're concerned that your risk level might not be, or might be different, and maybe the controls that are in place aren't appropriate for you personally.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the high risk aspect, because I'm imagining that a lot of people are gonna, who might be at higher risk, are gonna start feeling pressure to do things that maybe they're not comfortable with. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and just the importance of having those hard conversations, hopefully in a setting where that can be heard. The next question from Veronica: there's uncertainty around how long a vaccine would protect someone, for a few months versus 6 months versus 1 year or more. If the vaccine's protection only lasts months, what would that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it would impact the degree to which, a vaccine kind of solves the problem. Yeah, I think, even if a vaccine protected, if the vaccine's average protection was still only, 6 months or something, I would say even then that would be a massive improvement from where we are now, right? And we, as a society, we're accustomed to things like getting booster doses for our flu vaccines on an annual basis. That's something that, once we're used to doing that, and we identified the vaccine, and we've already built the infrastructure to manufacture it, that's perfectly fine. If we end up in a situation where people need to get COVID booster doses on an annual basis, okay, we can still go about our normal lives that way. I would say that's totally not a disaster, right? It's more inconvenient and it's more work, but I think it can still get us out of this mess.
Yeah, along those lines, would that be kind of like in a world where COVID sort of becomes like not like it is now, but actually kind of like the flu?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a lot of good reasons to compare COVID to the flu. If there's one thing that I like about this virus, and there's very few things that I like about it, the one thing that I like about it is that it mutates, it changes much more slowly than a lot of other viruses that we're used to from the data that we have now. So flu mutates very quickly. That's why we get new strains every year. Coronavirus thus far mutates at a far lower rate. Something more akin to what you see with viruses like measles, where it's not always coming up with new strains and you need new vaccines. You get one vaccine and that one's good. It just kind of has worked for decades, and we've never had to make really a new one. So that gives me a lot of encouragement, on the vaccine front, that this is probably not going to be, a terribly tough nut to crack, and that a vaccine that we developed could be, useful for a longer period of time. Speaking a little bit ahead there, it's possible the virus could start to mutate more once it starts to encounter more immune pressure, from people who have been vaccinated or have already been infected. We don't know that for sure, but for the moment, it looks, probably like it's less problematic than the flu in terms of that mutation rate.
Next question from Kim. What's the current thinking about developing immunity? Does this seem likely? And I guess that would apply to once you're infected, after you're infected. Maybe.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for asking this question. If there's anything that drives me crazy in the media right now, it's when I see this question pop up. Because it kind of raises the notion that, I'll get infected and then a week later I'll get infected again and it could be just as bad. That's not going to happen. So Now, you'll hear people kind of hedge they're talking about that if they're public health officials and all that, and they'll say, well, we don't really know yet. And yes, technically, we don't have a whole bunch of people that we've infected twice to see how it went the second go round. But okay, why can I nevertheless be pretty confident that if you've had it once, you should feel really good that you're immune, at least for months or years or maybe your whole life? The reason I feel good about that is because before coronavirus, there have been hundreds, literally hundreds of known human respiratory viruses, okay? And every single one of them, if you get that respiratory infection, you develop immunity to that infection. And it lasts either for, at the minimum, several months or years, right? Or until the virus, like the flu, mutates and it's actually a different virus, right? So it's not that you're not immune, it's that a different virus is coming back in. So that plus a lot of the laboratory data that we've got, they've done these studies where they've, infected animals with coronavirus and then tried to reinfect them. And the second go round, the animals are completely protected from a second infection. So both the precedent of everything we know about respiratory viruses and the laboratory work that's going on right now really, points to, immunity is a real thing. This is what your body is built to do. And I would encourage people to put that down as, on the list of things that we're afraid of right now. Let's just cross that one off. There's enough other things on it.
Yeah.
The other thing that's important about that to realize is, this question of can we develop immunity? If you couldn't develop immunity, how would you ever recover from the virus in the first place? Right? That kind of doesn't make sense. The fact that your body has learned to fight it off means that your body has learned to fight it off. And will do so again in the future.
Yeah, that's helpful, and it's nice to hear that there's certain fears that pop up in the news and stuff that we can just discard for the time being. So thanks for that.
Yeah, well, I got a note from Jason that said, "Speak a bit more to reinfection." Are there kind of specific sub questions there that I can try to address or? Yeah. So I'll say that. So going on that a little bit more, how long antibodies last is a good question. There are examples of respiratory viruses that you can get infected with more than once. The one you may have heard of is called RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus. It's known for causing problems mostly in young children or the elderly. And that is a virus where we do know it can infect you several times over the course of your life, even though it doesn't mutate all that much. That said, even for that virus, that first infection when you're, a toddler can be pretty rough. But all the rest of those infections, which you might get every 4 or 5 years over the course of your virus a number of times, they're never severe until you become elderly or immunocompromised or your body just can't fight it off. So even for that precedent, yes, it might be possible for you to get reinfected, but I want to be really careful when I say that. Right now, we think I'm going to get infected with COVID, and you picture all these people in the hospital, all this severe disease, right? I think the chances, it's possible you might be able to get reinfected. I think the chances of the second infection being anywhere near as bad as the first infection are very, very small. So again, right now, I think that's something that there's no science whatsoever saying that people can get serious disease on second infection with the same coronavirus.
Thanks for that. That's also really helpful in terms of clarifying some of those bigger fears out there. And I think some of them, it's like good questions and based on this sense of this feeling so out of control. Right. And this real fear, because it kind of came out of nowhere, a fear that it might, never end in a sense. I know I've had moments of wondering about that. So it's really helpful to get some good answers on that. This next question from Torelli is very prescient for right now. And I think it's the question a lot of people are asking. What are the risks when protesting in a large group or in large groups?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as far as the virus is concerned, the virus doesn't really care why you got your large group together, right? What the large group is doing is pretty irrelevant as far as viral transmission goes. If you've got large groups of people gathered in close proximity, Some of those people in that crowd are going to have the virus, and the virus is going to spread to some of the other people in that crowd. Now, right now in the Bay Area, I'll say our infection rate is really quite low. There's not tons of people who have it, but that said, I think it would be not at all surprising to see, the recent protests have created opportunities for the virus to spread. I think if we kept doing that, for months and months, you'd see, the rounds of amplification there. If the virus to incubate in a given person before it can spread to the next person, right? So I think a big factor will be how long these kind of mass protests, go on. The longer they go on, the more chance there is for multiple rounds of transmission, and then you start to get into that exponential kind of growth curve. For all those reasons, now I'm not telling people that they shouldn't go protest, because I understand what's going on, and I understand the things that need to be spoken up for here. But I'll say that if you want to participate in those protests, anything that you can do to help minimize the risk of transmission while doing that, you might make a decision that's a risk decision you're willing to take. And I have no grounds to tell you that you're wrong. I can just tell you what the risk is. Anything you can do to reduce the risk. I will say, I've seen protesters are wearing masks, right? And almost all of the protesters are wearing masks. That's really good. That said, it's not a panacea, so still being able to socially distancing in a couple thousand people protest doesn't really sound to me like a viable option, but, to the degree that you can keep some space between people, that may be helpful. But it's definitely a riskier environment.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. Next question from Thomas. There have been a number of published or at least publicized studies related to COVID-19 that have later been retracted or contradicted due to poor methodology. Do you think the scientific peer review process is up to the task of responding to a fast-moving situation like the current pandemic?
That's a great question. So the scientific review process is not designed for speed, right? It's designed to, over many iterations, winnow out the truth from all the things that can go wrong in science, whether it's, people, running the experiment in a biased way, or whether it's, somebody just making a mistake in the way they do the experiment. Lots of things can go wrong. So that's what the peer review process is really designed for, and it does a great job. It's in this situation, what we've seen is a lot of things hitting the press before they've had any peer review whatsoever, or any peer review has even been attempted. And so I think that's what you're feeling there, is that there's a lot of things are being posted to websites that are called preprint servers. Normally in science, you don't use these things. You go out of your way specifically to avoid using those things because you don't want non-peer review data out there. In this situation, a lot of times it makes sense because it's making the data very widely available very fast, and we need that. So I think it's good that that's happening. I think the degree to which those things immediately hit CNN, right? And where they're not being read by other scientists, who can contextualize it and understand it, that it becomes mass media the day it's posted. I think that is very problematic because that ends up with a lot of I don't want to say misinformation, but potentially inaccurate information out there. Like just to cite one specific example, I was very unhappy with you may have seen there was an antibody study done in Santa Clara County trying to figure out what percentage of people had antibodies. And that started from something got published, and then people made conclusions about how many people must have been infected, made conclusions about what the death rate might actually be, made conclusions about whether or not we're overreacting to this virus, that the death rate is really lower than we thought, right? And so it went like that, like within hours of this data being published. But a lot of if you go back and look at the data, a lot of the kind of steps along that way were not very good steps scientifically, right? The virus is not any less dangerous than we thought before that study got published. But that sort of thing, I think, is really unhelpful, right? And I know that's really hard for people, to navigate kind of, in who aren't scientists. So I would say, when you see that sort of thing in the media, just take it with a grain of salt and go, okay, brand new, breaking news, new science. If it's brand new science, that is synonymous with might not be true, because we haven't had a chance to look at it yet.
Yeah, that's helpful. I actually remember when that Santa Clara study came out, and it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was when I was, it was April-ish, more nervous than I might feel right now, and kind of really latching onto it as like, oh, this is great news, and then it kind of was like, oh, never mind. This next question from Tom. Hi, Scott. What is your, and this is interesting, I think this will help us get to know a little bit more about what you're actually working on right now, but what is your personal role in the search for a vaccine or remedy for minimizing the effects of COVID-19? Are you working specifically on, I forgot, I don't know how to say it, but
remdesivir. Yeah. So
remdesivir.
Fascinating as this question is, I'm largely not going to answer it, because that a lot of that is kind of Gilead information. I'm not speaking here as an official representative of Gilead, and I can't give away. A lot of this is very sensitive information right now in terms of anything coronavirus related. I'll say that, like many other people at Gilead, I've been drawn in part-time to kind of like help out with a lot of the coronavirus work. It's been an amazing kind of all hands on deck, kind of like, let's make this happen sort of effort at Gilead. And it's been really, really inspiring for me to see my coworkers do that. But I can't say much specifically about that.
Yeah, I get that. And thank you, Tom, for trying to get the information out, but I also totally understand why you can't really go there. Yeah, we have some questions here. One thing before we move on along those lines, it hasn't come up yet, but I bet some people are curious. Broadly speaking, therapeutics, is there the potential that enough therapeutics could allow us to go back to normal before a vaccine?
I would say the most likely scenario, well, a vaccine is probably a better solution for the long term, for a variety of reasons. Therapeutics are definitely going to help. I think you saw a lot of positive reaction, to remdesivir. We have something that does help, and that's a big difference from I have nothing that helps, right? For the clinicians, for the patients, that's a really good thing. There are a number of other things that, other companies are developing, not at Gilead, so I can speak to that a little bit because it's not, it's public information. A lot of other things that are being tested that you'll probably see some significant results come out, most likely, more like maybe in the fall, when you'll start to see some of the most promising ones of those kind of, really maybe take the next step of something that's, bringing it down the mortality rate or helping with it. I think that treating people who are already quite sick is not nearly as good as stopping them from getting quite sick in the first place, right? And so that's kind of the reason why vaccines are going to be a lot better and make people a lot more comfortable. That said, I think it really will be a big help if we can, even if we can only get treatments to those people who are most sick. If we can drive down the mortality rate in those patients substantially, I think we'll all feel a lot more comfortable, going about greater levels of activity in society, right? Because, having a bad flu stinks, but, if you get over it, it's okay. Even having a really bad flu and having to go in the hospital and get oxygen, that's scary. But if you come back out of that hospital, a few days later, okay, right? It's the people that aren't leaving the hospital that are making us have to go to these extents. So I think therapeutics absolutely will really help us out, but they're not really a substitute for a vaccine.
Yeah, that's helpful to hear. Next question from Paul Trudeau. I'm amazed that our City Hope friends are doing so well. Praise God. my fear is that it is only a matter of time before it hits the Tenderloin and the large homeless shelter community. Can you address any info on our most vulnerable communities? It's a really good question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Paul, you know that I share that fear. At the beginning of this, for everybody else, Paul and I had some conversations about, kind of how to deal with this, and definitely being afraid for people who are on the streets. They're not going to be in the best health in the first place, and many of them have, medical issues, that could put them at higher risk. It does seem, I think a lot of credit needs to be given to, our leadership in San Francisco as well as in California in terms of acting very early. We didn't have the New York situation, right? Where we had the big spike. We kind of never got the spike in the first place. We've flattened the curve very, very early on. And I think, that's what's really protected our most vulnerable communities so far. And I think is why, again, when you're thinking about what comes in this next phase of normal, you want to think not just about what's an acceptable risk for me or my family, but what do I owe to my brothers and sisters in the community, right, who may be at higher risk than me? What are the steps that I should take, that keeps them safe, right? From me being, for those of us who are in the younger, healthier cohort, probably the biggest risk for us is not that we actually, die from this virus, but that we transmit this virus to somebody else who might be a lot more susceptible. So I think that those are things that we should be keeping in mind, and again, a lot of those little things, masks, social distancing, especially, like I talked about, we might want to start having more personal interactions. You're going to the barber and whatnot. Those things all make sense. But we want to also be thinking about, just make sure you're thinking a little differently when you're going, oh, I'm going to go see somebody, that person's higher risk, I should do something differently. Or how many people have I seen in the last week before I go see my grandma? Or if I'm going to interact with somebody who's at greater risk, what things can I do to kind of reduce the risk that I am a transmission, vector for the virus?
Yeah, maybe even before those visits, maybe doing a very low risk 2 weeks prior or something like that before you go see grandma or high risk person.
Yeah, and anything that we can do to just keep those people, healthy and help them reduce their risks. Things like, I'll just give a shout out to City Hope here. I promise Paul did not plan this question in advance. This is from the heart. The things like City Hope is doing to like deliver groceries to people who are at very high risk and don't want to leave their apartments. Like, that's huge, right? That's life-saving, because those people will not have to be exposed to the virus. Keeping the people on the streets fed, so their bodies stay stronger, that's life-saving work. So I know, like City Hope, if anybody's, for people who have served at City Hope recently, it looks a little different. It feels a little different than it used to. But man, that's the kind of thing that we can do for our vulnerable communities is support them, in very practical ways.
Next question here, and we'll probably only be able to take a few more, I'm guessing. We are running over on purpose because we lost about 10 minutes, but now we're over that. And I am seeing from my other screen that people are staying on here, which means they're not bored yet, which doesn't surprise me. The next question from Crystal, what accounts for the variety of symptoms in people?
So a great question, and the answer is many things, which is why you see such a variety of symptoms. The virus itself is basically the same. Like I said, the mutation is very low, so it's not really the virus accounting for the variety. It's the people. And this is very typical of viruses. This is not unusual for coronavirus. For the flu kills, tens of thousands to maybe 100,000 people. Well, probably maybe 10,000 or so, a few tens of thousands in the U.S., a few 100,000 globally is what I was trying to say, every year. And you have exactly the same spectrum. Some people totally asymptomatic. Some people, I got a little flu. Some people, this is life-threatening or fatal. So there's nothing about that's unusual, right? Just in terms of different people have, different kind of ability to fight off the virus. that kind of explains the kind of curve that you see where it's, very low risk or low disease severity, I should say, in younger people, and it gets worse the older you get and the more pre-existing conditions you get. That kind of explains that. The other factor, though, that I do want to mention, about the variety of symptoms, what we don't have a good explanation for is why does the occasional apparently healthy person get really severely ill, right? That we don't honestly know. That does happen, with other viruses as well. It's very rare, but sometimes somebody that's young and apparently healthy will get a really severe case of the flu or something like that. So it's not unheard of. It's not, anything that bizarre about coronavirus. But there are definitely a lot of things about the virus we still don't know and understand. The last point I'll make about that, because again, with all the comparisons with the flu, one really important difference between the coronavirus and the flu that can help people understand the symptoms is that the flu really restricts itself to your airway, to your, from your nose down into your lungs. That's where the flu is doing its thing. One of the things we've learned about this coronavirus is that the coronavirus is spreading beyond the lungs to other organ systems in the body, particularly in the GI tract, but also other places. It looks like it can infect, some of the blood vessels, in the body. That might be able to explain some of the clotting syndromes you may have heard about. So, that is also an important factor that is kind of giving these different symptoms.
It's a helpful distinction. Yeah, I haven't heard anyone lay that out so clearly yet. Next question, I'm thinking, if it's okay with Jason and Scott, I'm thinking maybe one more question after this before we wrap up. But from Crystal, can you share how hand sanitizer and soap kill the virus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So viruses are actually, even though they're very, very small, they're actually quite intricate. And the virus particle itself has, a variety of different pieces that need to be assembled in the right way. Those things, hand sanitizer or soap, really what they do is just to disrupt that structure, right? So if you think about the way that soap can, take grease off of your pan, the outer layer of the virus is actually a greasy layer. That is then, wrapped, and that's wrapping around like a kind of protein core. And so if you get soap on that, it strips that greasy outer layer off, and the virus can't survive without that. It can't do its job without that greasy outer layer. So, or outer layer. So that stuff is actually physically breaking the virus.
Thanks for sharing that. I don't think I understood how soap actually works until this past February. So. I think I also learned how to properly wash my hands in February too. So. And last but not least, can you explain the confusion around hydroxychloroquine? What do we know? And final question, is the CDC the best place to get current info?
Okay, so two good questions. Hydroxychloroquine, don't use it, don't take it. It's probably bad for you. If it had not been so publicly promoted by the president, right, this would never have really probably entered your consciousness in the first place. There was never great data about it. It's very common to have small studies like we had early in the pandemic where you've got, you don't have good control groups. You gave it to a few people and they kind of look like they got better. And you had like 10 people that got the drug and 10 people that didn't. And well, these ones did a little better. And, in the scientific community, again, it's normal to get those kind of studies out. But again, scientists view those with great skepticism because there's so many things that go wrong in those kinds of studies. I don't think anyone should be promoting any drug for any disease ever without good, solid evidence that it works, because I think what the president was saying is, what do you have to lose if taking this drug? Well, it turns out that it for some people it can cause heart failure, right? And so whether it's hydroxychloroquine or other things that you may have heard about, like, don't go taking things that you read on the internet. Don't go taking things that you heard your really smart uncle say is a good idea. Like, trust in the medical science. It's taking time, and that's hard because we want answers faster. But taking things that are not properly tested is as likely to be dangerous, probably more likely to be dangerous than it's likely to be helpful. And then the CDC. Okay, final question about the CDC. The best place to get info. Generally speaking, yes. The CDC is a great place to get information. I think all the information that they've put out has been accurate, right, and has been good. At the same time, I think I'll say, many of us, and I'll speak personally on this, certainly for me, as somebody who's worked at the CDC, have been disappointed to see the CDC not be out front more on this pandemic. The CDC was literally created for this purpose. It was built in the 20th century because of malaria outbreaks, and they do other things now. They do, heart disease, obesity, non-infectious diseases that are of great importance. But this is the CDC's, founding mission, is to control these kind of outbreaks. And I think the thing that's been really hard is that we haven't seen the messaging coming from the CDC. I mean, thank the Lord for Tony Fauci. He's actually the NIH, not the CDC, but he's been really, really great. But we should have had a lot more of the CDC, out there getting information, being the ringmaster that's coordinating everything and making sure things work. A lot of that didn't happen. There's a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. And again, I won't go into it a bunch. But I will say that, as much as the CDC, may have been hampered in its ability to do some of the things that maybe it should have done, from everything I've read, the information they're giving out is factually accurate and correct.
Well, I think we'll finish up there. Thank you so much, Scott, for doing this with us. I'd like you to imagine 50 clapping hands right now that I'm sure are out there on the internet. This was also just really enjoyable and fascinating for me as well. And we'll continue to keep you in prayer as you do important work on all of our behalf at Gilead.
Thank you very much. Love you, City Church. Miss you, City Church.
Yeah, we love you all too. And for those still on here, we'll be doing another one of these next week. We'll be kind of hitting the other end of, I think, a lot of people's anxiety about the pandemic. First, we're probably worried about the virus. Second, we're probably worried about the economic impact. And many of us, no doubt, are already feeling a lot of that. So we'll have Sarah Bear on here, a City Church member who is a financial analyst. And we'll be talking about how to approach finances, how to approach financial planning, and questions like that. So come back on a week from today at 7 p.m. and we'll be doing that again. And last but not least, we will be reposting an edited video of this, edited version of this broadcast, hopefully without the little break that we had in the middle. So that'll be up on our YouTube channel pretty soon. So if you want to, as long as it's okay with Scott, that's going to be up on our YouTube channel. I probably should have asked you about that. So we'll be up there, and if you have, okay, and it'll be on Facebook as well. So if you want to come back to this, or if you have any people in your life that you think would benefit from it, we'll have that up there as a resource. But again, Scott, thank you so much, and thank all of you for making time for this tonight. And last but not least, Jason Morrell is the engine behind Internet City Church right now. So this ship would be
thank you, Jason,
underwater without him. So thank you for being on here too.